In the past 2 lectures, we've seen how Jesus' apocalyptic message led to his execution in Jerusalem. It happened at the time of the Passover, when thousands of Jews would come to the holy city to commemorate the great act of salvation that God had performed on their behalf in the distant past, when he saved their ancestors from the oppression of a foreign power. Many of these worshiping Jews, of course, hoped that God would do so again. This made the Passover feast a particularly incendiary time during the Roman period. We know from Josephus of riots that had broken out during the festival, in which thousands of people were killed. And we know of other years in which prophets came to Jerusalem during the celebrations to announce that God was going to intervene on behalf of his people. In no instance did these prophetic declarations end happily. Inevitably, prophets were seen as a threat to the stability of the social order and were punished. So too with Jesus. Arrested by the authorities as a potential troublemaker, possibly on suspicion that his apocalyptic predictions might cause a riot or even foment an uprising, they had him turned over to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate for punishment. We're not well informed about what actually happened at Jesus' trial before Pilate. In an earlier lecture, I discussed Pilate's position as governor of the Roman province of Judea. Provincial governors were Roman aristocrats who were appointed to govern the various lands Rome had conquered. Pilate himself was not in the very upper crust of the Roman aristocracy. He was of what was called the equestrian rank rather than the senatorial. He wasn't a Roman senator sent out to be a governor. He was the economic class right below the senators, the equestrian or the knight class. As with all governors, Pontius Pilate had 2 major responsibilities: to bring in the tribute and to keep the peace. The central imperial government in Rome accorded its governors virtually free rein to do what was necessary in order to fulfill these obligations. Among other things, this meant that Pilate had the power of life and death, with no requirement of trial by jury, careful cross-examination of all witnesses, the possibility of judicial appeal, or anything else that might strike us today as due process. Pilate's job was to conduct a trial quickly and fairly in order to accomplish his goals of making sure that there were no riots. In most cases, governors in situations like this decided a case quickly and efficiently, and then the sentence was carried out immediately. There were no long waits on death row while some appeal was made. If a governor found an offender guilty, they were simply taken off and punished on the spot. If it were a particularly problematic case, then the execution might be ordered to be slow and painful. It's not completely clear why the Jewish authorities who had Jesus arrested in the first place didn't handle the problem posed by Jesus themselves. It doesn't look to me that the Romans were the ones who went out and arrested Jesus. It appears from our earliest sources, they all agree that in fact it was the Jewish authorities who had Jesus arrested, probably because they found his teachings about the temple and his stirring up the crowds problematic. The Romans would have been happy to comply with what the Jewish authorities wanted in this case, but the Romans weren't the ones who went out and arrested Jesus, it appears. Well, why then didn't the Jewish authorities who had Jesus arrested take care of the problem themselves? Well, there are several possibilities. It's possible that the Jewish authorities simply wanted to show deference to the Roman prefect, who was, after all, in town precisely in order to take care of such problems during the Passover. So maybe it was just simply out of deference to Pontius Pilate that the Jewish Sanhedrin had Jesus delivered over to him. Or it's possible that the authorities really were concerned about the large following Jesus was acquiring. if in fact he was acquiring a large following. It's somewhat hard to know how large the following was. If so, if they were concerned about it, they may not have wanted to incur any animosity among the masses. They didn't want the crowds to be angry with them, possibly. It's also possible that the Jewish authorities wanted Jesus to be taken out of the way completely. That is, that they wanted him to be executed. Most historians believe that even though the Romans allowed the local aristocracies to run their own affairs, they reserved the right of capital punishment for themselves. In other words, if Caiaphas wanted Jesus to be executed, he simply couldn't order that he be stoned to death or that he be crucified, because the Jewish authorities didn't have that right under the Roman governance of their province. And so if Caiaphas did want Jesus taken out of the way permanently, he would have had to have Pilate do so for him. It's difficult to know what transpired then when Jesus did appear before Pontius Pilate. His followers, who later told stories about this trial, were not there to see it happen. The principal participants, Pilate and the chief priests, would not have been likely to release details to inquiring Christians later. So where do the stories come from that we have in the Gospels? We have accounts of Jesus appearing before Pilate. There's an interrogation that takes place, but the people who are recording the events weren't there, and the people participating in the events probably didn't give them the information. So where did they get their information from? Well, these stories may be the result of simply oral traditions. As people told the tales of Jesus' trial before Pilate, they added some of the details that we now have in the Gospels. In particular, the Gospel accounts that there were large crowds at the trial who were participating in it simply do not pass the criterion of contextual credibility. I pointed out in an earlier lecture that we know something about Pilate's rule as the governor of Judea. Our information comes from our principal source of knowledge of first century Palestine, the historian Josephus, who tells us a few things about Pilate. What little he tells us makes it fairly clear that Pilate was a brutal ruler who did not cater at all to the whim of the populace. In fact, Pilate more frequently butted heads with the populace in Jerusalem and in other places in Palestine because he refused to cater to their whim. Only on rare occasion was he actually backed down by Jews in Palestine. So that the idea that you have in the Gospels that Pilate is asking the crowds, "Oh, what do you want me to do? I'll do whatever you wish." Well, that doesn't sound like the Pilate we know about from our other sources. Moreover, the idea of the crowds calling for Jesus' blood does not pass the criterion of dissimilarity. The way it works in our earliest account is that Pilate is asking Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus replies, "You say so." Pilate then turns to the crowds and says, "Should I release for you the king of the Jews?" And the crowds cry out, "No, release for us instead Barabbas." Barabbas, as it turns out, was a criminal who was in jail for an instigation against Rome. And evidently, according to the Gospels at least, it was Pilate's custom during the feast to release one criminal that the crowds desired. Rather than desiring Jesus, then the crowds want to have this person Barabbas released to them, one who's in jail for some kind of uprising against the Romans. And so Pilate then agrees to release Barabbas. He asks the crowd, "What should I do with this person?" Jesus, they say, "Crucify him." And in order to give in to the crowds, then Pilate orders Jesus to be crucified. This doesn't pass the criterion of dissimilarity, precisely because we know that Christians who were later telling the story may have wanted to emphasize the culpability of the Jewish people in the death of Jesus. As you trace the tradition of Jesus' execution through our sources, it becomes clear that with the passing of time, the Christians who are telling the stories place more and more blame on the Jewish people for the death of Jesus and less blame on the Romans for his death. In fact, you can trace this movement through the Gospels themselves. It's very interesting to do so. The earliest Gospel, Mark, has Pilate asking the crowds, what do you want me to do with Jesus? Crucify him, and to give in to the whim of the crowds. Then he crucifies him. About 10 or 15 years later, we have the Gospel of Luke, who tells the same story, but puts a different slant on it. In Luke's Gospel, on 3 separate occasions, Pilate declares that Jesus is innocent and tries to release him, but the Jewish crowds refuse. And so in this account, the reason Jesus gets crucified is because the Jewish people really want him crucified, even though the Pilate, the Roman government, doesn't. The Gospel of Matthew, written about the same time, tells the same story. But in Matthew's Gospel, Pilate not only declares that Jesus is innocent, when the crowds insist on Jesus being executed, Pilate calls for a basin of water, and they bring water to him, and he washes his hands in front of the crowd and says that I am innocent. I wash my hands of this man's blood. I'm innocent of this blood. And the crowd then cries out, this is only in Matthew's Gospel, the crowd cries out, his blood be upon us and our children. In other words, the Jewish people are taking responsibility for Jesus' death and passing that responsibility on to their own descendants. This verse, found only in Matthew's Gospel, was used, of course, through the ages in order to show that the Jews were Christ killers. It's found only in Matthew, though. It's a later development. You see, what's happening is the Jews are becoming more guilty. The Romans are becoming more innocent. It becomes even clearer in the Gospel of John, our last Gospel. In John's Gospel, Pilate 3 times tries to release Jesus. The crowds won't let him. They finally say to Pilate that if you release Jesus, you are not a friend of Caesar. They threaten to take his case before the Roman emperor if you won't release. And so then it says in John's Gospel that Pilate handed Jesus over to them to be executed. It's usually translated out of the English translations you read because it doesn't make any sense. Pilate hands Jesus over to the Jews so that they're going to execute him, but that's what the text says. Even later, in the Gospel of Peter, as we've seen, the Jews are fully responsible. It's not even Pilate who orders his execution in the Gospel of Peter. Instead, it's Herod, the Jewish king, that orders Jesus executed, and it's Jews who kill him. This tradition, in which Pilate gets increasingly exonerated and the Jews become increasingly guilty, is carried out into the 2nd century in some very intriguing traditions. In some parts of the Christian church in the 2nd century, Pilate was thought to be completely innocent. In some traditions that circulated at the end of the 2nd century, it was alleged that Pilate later regretted what had happened and himself converted to be a Christian after Jesus' death. We have an account cited in an early church father of, it's a legendary account, that the next week or so, Pilate is really upset about what happened, and he wrote a letter to the Roman emperor saying, oh, you won't believe what I did. Yes, I crucified the Son of God. We're in trouble here. He's going on like this. In parts of the Christian church, in the Ethiopian church, Pilate was eventually canonized as a Christian saint. Well, what's this all about? Why is Pilate made to look more innocent? Well, the more you make Pilate look innocent, then the more you make the Jews look guilty. As Christians and Jews start fighting it out more and more, Christians start attacking Jews for the killing of Jesus. This, in part, also, as the story gets told later on in the tradition, is to show that, in fact, the Romans never were opposed to Jesus. This is a way of Christians saying Romans shouldn't be opposed to us. Christians who are being persecuted by the state could say, we've never done anything wrong, all the way back to Jesus himself. That, in fact, the Roman prefect, Pilate himself, declared Jesus innocent. Well, in point of fact, we don't really know very much about what happened at this trial before Pilate. It is pretty clear, though, I think, that it was not the Jewish crowds that were ultimately responsible for Jesus being killed. The Jewish leaders delivered Jesus over to Pilate, and Pilate, after a short trial, ordered Jesus to be crucified. It is pretty certain what the point at issue was in Jesus' trial before Pilate, even if we don't know all of the specifics. The point at issue was Jesus' own claims about himself. Pilate would not have cared a bit about whether Jesus, for example, kept the Sabbath, something that some Jewish Pharisees were offended by. Pilate wouldn't have cared whether Jesus told people that they ought to love one another, or whether he urged his followers to give up their wealth. What he would have cared about were the things that related to his rule as a representative of Rome. It's independently attested that the ground of execution for Jesus was that he called himself the King of the Jews. It's independently attested in Mark and in John. Moreover, it's not only multiply attested that this is the case, and it's not only contextually credible that that would be a charge to have Jesus crucified for, the charge also passes the criterion of dissimilarity. Christians who are telling the stories about Jesus called him a number of things. They called him the Son of God, the Son of Man, the Lord of all. They eventually called him God. It's interesting that throughout the New Testament, no Christian author calls Jesus the King of the Jews. In other words, Christians didn't think about Jesus that way so that they wouldn't have modified the traditions about his death so that he's killed for claiming to be King of the Jews, because they didn't call him King of the Jews. Why then is our tradition filled with this idea that he's killed for calling himself King of the Jews? Well, that's probably why he really was killed. It passes the criterion of dissimilarity. Mark's account of the trial was not an eyewitness report, but it's probably not far off in its essentials. Pilate, having heard from the Jewish chief priests that Jesus was known to speak of himself as the Messiah, that is, the king, future king, asked Jesus about it. Jesus either admitted to the charge or he did little or nothing to defend himself against it. That would make sense of all of these data. Pilate then needed to hear no more. Jesus was a potential troublemaker who was stirring up the crowds and who thought of himself as a political usurper of the prerogatives of Rome. Without further ado, Pilate ordered him executed as an enemy of the state. The trial of Jesus itself was probably short and to the point. It may not have lasted more than a couple of minutes. It was probably one of several items on a crowded morning agenda that the governor had. 2 other persons were charged with sedition the same morning. All 3 people were taken outside of the city gates to be crucified. Crucifixion was a horribly slow and torturous death, reserved by the Romans for the lowest of criminals. Unlike modern Western societies, Romans did not think that death sentences should be carried out in as humane and private manner as possible. In our system of justice, we think that if somebody is going to be executed, it should be done privately. You should figure out a humane way to do it. That's the way we look at things. Romans had a completely different way of thinking about it. Romans used public torture as a deterrent for crime, a way to show everyone who could see that the power of the empire could be brutally brought to bear against the body of anyone who dared to defy it. In other words, I mean, if the Romans had problems with things like carjacking, they wouldn't deal with these things kind of privately in some court out of the way. The Roman approach was that if you have somebody who's committed a carjacking, you crucify the person in public after humiliating and torturing the person, and then you let everybody walk by, see the person crucified in the public square, and then see how much carjacking takes place. That was their logic of punishment. Jesus, of course, was not the only person crucified in the ancient world. This was a common mode of execution for slaves, common criminals, rabble-rousers, people causing sedition. When the Roman general Titus overthrew Jerusalem during the first uprising, Jerusalem fell in the year 70 A.D., Titus crucified so many people that he ran out of lumber. This was a common mode of execution. According to the gospel traditions, before Jesus was led off to be executed, he was flogged. This is multiply attested in both Mark 15 and John 19. Flogging was itself a horrible punishment. The Romans would use leather thongs that had little pieces of glass or bone tied to the ends, so that when they would flog a person, they would drag it across their back and rip off the skin and then the inner muscle. It's hard to say whether this account of Jesus being flogged is a Christian addition to the story in order to show how much he suffered, or if it's a historical account. This kind of flogging itself, of course, could practically kill a person. Since public torture of criminals from the lower classes was the rule of the day in the empire, then the accounts in general terms are completely plausible. It may well be that Jesus was flogged before being crucified. Jesus and the others then would have been taken by soldiers outside the city gates. We don't know the place of Jesus' crucifixion. If you visit Jerusalem, you'll have people tell you that it was this place or it was that place. In fact, we don't know where it would have taken place. It does appear that the person who was going to be crucified was made to carry the cross beam of the cross to the upright stakes that were kept at the site of execution, which apparently was outside of the city walls. The uprights for the crosses were reused, possibly reused every day. At the place of execution, the condemned would have been nailed to the cross beams, or possibly to the uprights themselves, through the wrists and possibly through the ankles. The way the crucifixion worked then is they would not nail the crucified person through the hands the way it's normally portrayed in art, because if the person's nailed through the hands, then when they're hanging up, the nails would actually rip out. And so they would nail them between the two large bones in the wrist. And often it appears that they would nail them through the ankles. There might have been, there sometimes was apparently, a small ledge that was attached to the upright that would allow the person to sit while they were dying. We know a little bit more about crucifixion now than we used to. We used to know only on the basis of what was said in our literary sources, and these sources were not completely forthcoming about the process because it was thought to be such a horrible thing that people didn't describe it. Plus, they probably didn't need to describe it because everybody knew what it involved. We're a little bit better informed now because of an archaeological discovery made some 30 years ago. They discovered a partial skeleton of a crucified man named Yehochanan, whose ankle bones were still attached to a piece of olive wood through which a stake had been driven. The nail that had been used to crucify this person had been driven into a knot in the wood, and so they had trouble removing it. And so he was buried. His skeleton was still partially there, but the nail was still through the ankle. Yehochanan appears to have been, in his case, to have been tied to the cross by his arms, but then been nailed through the ankles. It appears, though, that more commonly a person would have been nailed through the wrists, as I've indicated. The death by crucifixion was slow and painful. It didn't come by loss of blood, but by suffocation. The person would be hanging on the cross, and the lung cavity would distend as the weight of the body bore down upon it. And the only way the person could survive was by pulling up, either on their arms tied or nailed to the upright or to the crossbeam, or else pushing up on the nails that were through the ankles. The death would then be prolonged for as long as the person had strength to continue pulling up to relieve the pressure on their chest. Sometimes, in fact, this took days. In Jesus' case, death came quickly, within several hours, possibly because he had been so badly abused already. Jesus' disciples weren't there with him to see these things happen, although we do have an account that some of the women who had come with him from Galilee were looking on from a distance. None of them would have been close enough, though, to hear what, if anything, he said at the end. And so the accounts of Jesus' 7 last words of the dying Jesus are not things that anybody was there probably to have heard. By mid-afternoon, on the day before the Sabbath, so it's a Friday apparently, Jesus was dead. In several accounts, we're told that Jesus' body was buried by an influential but secret follower, a man named Joseph of Arimathea. Mark, John, Gospel Peter all say this. Some scholars have called into question Jesus' burial by Joseph on the grounds of contextual credibility. Normally, Romans did not allow crucified criminals to be buried properly. They either left their carcasses on the crosses to rot as further humiliation and to be devoured by scavengers there, or they tossed them into a common grave. At least one recent scholar, John Dominic Crossan, whom I've mentioned before, has argued that in fact Jesus' body was eaten by dogs. That admittedly is possible, but of course there's really no way historically to establish anything like that as a fact. It does, though, seem improbable, that, to me at least, that Jesus' corpse was simply left hanging on the cross. If it had been, then it'd be a little bit harder for his followers a little bit later to claim that it had been raised from the dead the third day later, third day afterwards. We can say then that probably Jesus' body was buried somewhere by someone, either by the soldiers in a common tomb, as was common practice, or by someone who was close to him, his family or a close follower, in a private tomb, as the tradition says. The really important thing, of course, is what his followers claimed happened next. Christianity is rooted in the belief that God raised Jesus from the dead. I've already pointed out why historians can't claim that the resurrection of Jesus probably happened. Even if it did happen, historians would have no way of demonstrating it, given the limitations of what can be appealed to as historical evidence. Historians can only establish what probably happened in the past, and a miracle of this nature is so highly improbable, and that's why we call it a miracle, that historians can't say that it probably happened. Moreover, the sources concerning the resurrection of Jesus are hopelessly contradictory. As you'll see, if you simply read all the accounts and compare what they say with one another, you'll see it's almost impossible to straighten out what happened. Who went to Jesus' tomb? How many people went? What were their names? What did they see when they got there? Whom did they meet? What were they told? What did they do as a result? All of these things are different among our various accounts. If you want to do a simple comparison, just compare Matthew and Luke about what the disciples are supposed to do. Matthew's disciples are told, go to Galilee to meet Jesus. And they go and they meet him. In Luke, the disciples are told, don't leave Jerusalem. And they stay in Jerusalem and meet Jesus. Well, which is it? In Luke's gospel, they stay there until the day of Pentecost, 50 days later. Well, which is it? These Gospels have contradictions about what happened at the resurrection. As a result of the limitations of our discipline and the problems posed by our sources, there is something that we simply cannot affirm as historians about the resurrection. We can't, first of all, affirm that Jesus was really raised, as I've indicated. I'm not saying you have to deny that he was raised. I'm saying as a historian you just can't say. Secondly, we can't say that he was buried in a private tomb. We don't know that. We can't, third, say that 3 days later that the tomb was empty. Nor can we say that 3 days later the disciples claimed that it was empty. We only know that at a later time they said that they had said 3 days later the tomb was empty, if you see what I mean. Nor do we even know that all of the remaining disciples, apart from Judas, actually became believers. We don't actually know that. What we do know, though, is important. We do know for a fact that some of Jesus' disciples, maybe all of them, maybe most of them, at least a few of them, disciples who knew that Jesus had been killed, at some later time claimed that his tomb was visited by some of his women followers 3 days later and they found it empty. These people also claim to have seen him alive afterwards. These people came to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And this claim completely changed their lives and the history of our world ever since.